Welcome to our summer self-care series. My name is Molly Hofer, and I am a family life educator with University of Illinois Extension. And this series is a collaboration between Illinois Extension and the Interdisciplinary Health Sciences Institute at our University of Illinois campus. This series is designed to connect those across the state and, of course, as we see by the chat box, those across the nation with researchers at the University of Illinois and provide evidence-based educational programming to you. If you have any questions during the program, you certainly can type your questions into the chat box. We will address them. If you are calling in, please hold your questions until the end of the session. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Corinne Cannavali. Corinne received a Bachelor of Science in Molecular and Cell Biology with a minor in chemistry from the University of Illinois in 2017. She is currently a PhD student in the Body Composition and Nutritional Neuroscience Lab, pardon me, where her primary research investigates how memory can be enhanced through diet and exercise. And today, Corinne is going to be talking with us about sleep and its impact on brain function. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Corinne.
Thank you, Molly. So like what was mentioned, I'm going to be talking about sleep and brain functioning today. And so before we get started, I just wanted you guys to go ahead and put some answers in the chat for how you guys feel after a poor night's sleep, just so we can connect some of those feelings and experiences back to what we're going to talk about today. So go ahead and put your answers in the chat. I'll give you a few minutes. Yeah, so a lot of people are putting grouchy, hard to focus, not energized, stressed. Somebody earlier said working at half capacity. That's a good one. Disorganized, in a fog. Yeah, so these are all really great. Dizzy, emotional, lethargic, wanting a nap, yes. Yeah, so these are all really great kind of anecdotal experiences that we all have as we miss a night of sleep, and maybe you have to stay up late, maybe you have to pull an all-nighter if you're a college student trying to get a paper done, and it kind of leaves you feeling really icky by the end of it. And so now just going a little bit into just a general overview of what sleep is. So sleeping is a vital process that we undergo. We spend about a third of our life sleeping, and we don't really understand totally why we sleep, but there are a variety of benefits both for the brain, the metabolism, as well as the immune system. And our brain is still active while we're undergoing these processes during sleep. So it's not like our brain shuts off for the night and nothing happens in our brains as we're sleeping. And so to display this, I wanted to show you guys, this is EEG recordings during sleep. And so basically what happens is we detect voltage changes on the scalp that are associated with activity in the brain. And we can see that when we're looking at waking EEG recordings, so on the left, these look similar, but also have some distinctly different patterns to both REM and non-REM sleep. And so there is brain activity still occurring. It just looks a lot different from the activity that we see while we're awake. And so like what was shown on this slide here, there's kind of different types of sleep. So there's REM sleep and non-REM sleep. So I'm going to go briefly through some of these stages of sleep that we experience. So there are 3 stages that are considered non-REM sleep, meaning that we don't have that rapid eye movement from side to side. And during these stages, we see a variety of changes in those EEG recordings that I showed you on the slide previously. But then there's also different physiological changes that we experience as we enter these different stages of sleep. So in stage 1, we kind of have that light sleep. Our heart rate and our breathing slows, our eye movements are going to slow, and we're going to start relaxing. This is also a stage where you can have kind of like hallucinations getting you ready for sleep. So a good example that I read about was if you've spent the day on a boat and then you go to sleep, during that stage 1 sleep is where you're going to kind of start feeling like you're sitting on a boat and rocking back and forth, similar to what you'd experience on the waves on this boat. And so those are kind of hallucinations that your brain might produce based on experiences that you have during the day. Another really cool one I read about is if you've been playing a lot of Tetris that day, during stage 1 sleep, you might hallucinate that you're actually playing Tetris in your head as you start falling asleep, which I thought was really fun. During stage 2, we're going to see a further slowing of the heart rate and the breathing. We're also going to have a temperature drop, and our muscles are going to relax further. But something different from stage 1 is that we're actually not going to get any eye movement during this stage. And so this is just a portion of sleep where our eyes are not going to be moving, but we're going to be relaxing. And then during stage 3 is where our sleep is going to be the most difficult to awake. The muscles get very relaxed. Our breathing is its slowest, and our heartbeat is its slowest. And I put a nice picture of my dog there where he's very hard to wake up from his naps. And then finally during REM sleep, which I think is the one that people hear a lot about because of this activity of our eyes where they're kind of rapidly moving back and forth from side to side. We also see faster and irregular breathing during REM sleep, and our heart rate and our blood pressure are actually going to increase to almost waking levels of heart rate and blood pressure. So it's a lot different from stage 3 sleep, where we're getting that really low breathing and low heart rate. This is also when our dreams occur, and because of that, our arms and legs become temporarily paralyzed, basically so that you don't start acting out your dreams. But this will be when our dreaming occurs, and the first cycle of REM starts about 90 minutes into sleep. And so here I've put up just a little graph. It doesn't name these the exact same way as I have. So on this graph here, stage 1 is REM, and then you would just subtract 1 from 2, 3, and 4 to get the ones that are actually occurring. So this stage 1 here is actually REM sleep. And so you can see here that about 90 minutes after sleeping is where we get that first cycle of REM, and it's the closest to being awake based on these physiological factors. But we kind of cycle in and out of these different stages of sleep over the course of the night until we wake up in the morning. And then just another little brief background about sleeping. This is kind of the internal clock of our body. It's called circadian rhythms. And this basically, the idea is that our bodies are working on about a 24-hour clock. And signals of sleep and wakefulness are going to kind of cycle back and forth through this 24-hour clock. And it's really dependent on time as well as light cycles. And so there are certain markers that are going to enhance sleep, and at the same time, they're going to inhibit the markers that enhance wakefulness. But then as our body shifts to the more daytime light hours of the day, these wakefulness markers are going to become more active, inhibit the sleep markers, and then produce wakefulness. And so over on the top corner, I included a really nice diagram that I found where it kind of talks about these light cycles with sleeping and with circadian rhythms. And so you can see that there are a lot of different things that happen over these light cycles during the day that occur because of the circadian cycling. So I think a big one, we have like this peak cortisol secretion during the morning. And so cortisol secretion is going to begin right at around this 6 a.m. point here. And then, melatonin, which is, I think, gets a lot of attention from people who are looking a bit more into how we actually sleep. That secretion will begin around 9 p.m. And this is really dependent on kind of these light cycles and these 24-hour cycles that our body goes through. And part of why our brain can receive signals from light and kind of go through these circadian cyclings based on what light exposure we're getting through the day is because of this region of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And basically, that's the region of the brain that's going to be receiving a lot of these light signals and then also transmitting signals for either sleep or wakefulness throughout the day, depending on the light that we're receiving. And so now looking ahead to how sleep can actually impact the brain. So I'm going to talk about a few different things. We're going to be talking about learning and memory, as well as emotional regulation, which I know a lot of you guys put in the chat, kind of feeling irritable and emotional during days where you've had less sleep. We'll also talk briefly about the immune system as well as metabolism. So less brain related, but still physiological changes that we'll see related to sleep. And so I'm going to start first with memory and learning. There have been a lot of studies that show that people who are sleeping after learning a rule set or some information can perform significantly better than those who did not sleep after learning. And so I included a chart from a paper here where they did a study where participants learned information either in the daytime, went through their day, and then were tested at nighttime. So they didn't have any sleep between learning and test. And then they had a similar group that learned at night, stayed up all night, and then were tested in the morning. So they did not have any sleep. And then they had another condition who were learning at night, sleeping, and then tested in the morning. And you can see that they're performing significantly better if they've had that sleep overnight. And that's due to some memory consolidation processes that I'm going to talk about on the next slide. But basically we see that the brain is consolidating memories and allowing our brains to really retain and learn that information that we experienced earlier in the day. And so there's this really cool study that kind of investigated how this happens. And so I briefly wanted to talk about it. Basically, what they did was they had participants go through a learning condition where they learned a set of rules. And while they learned those rules, they were presented an odor. For here, it was like the smell of roses. And then they went to sleep. And so during slow wave sleep, so that's kind of these earlier stage sleeps, not REM, they were presented either the odor that they were experiencing while they were learning, or what they call a vehicle, or basically just an odor that was not related to what they smelled during learning. Then they were tested on their memory the next morning, and they didn't have any odor present during that memory test. And so you can see in this chart on the left, they found that people who were given the odor during the slow wave sleep performed significantly better at test over the people who were given just a random scent at that slow wave sleep. And so they're thinking that they're reintroducing the context at which they learned that information so that during sleep, the body is able to reactivate what was going on during the context of that smell. And so then what they had them do was while they were sleeping, they were in an MRI scanner, and they were actually able to see activation in these regions of the brain that are responsible for memory functioning when that odor was given. So basically the odor was reintroducing the environment that they were in when they learned, and their body was then able to trigger reconsolidation of that memory more so than the people who were not reintroduced to that context. And so this is kind of where we can see that memory consolidation is actually occurring. And specifically when we have these kind of contexts reactivated, it will happen at even greater success. Does anybody have any questions about memory and learning before I move on?
Corinne, there was a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to address it now or later. How are some people morning people and others night owls?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that has to do with just like how certain people's bodies acclimate to their circadian cycling. I'm not 100% sure on how that occurs other than like changes in genetics. But yeah, that's a really great question that I think is not fully answered. And we'll talk about aging a bit later on because that will also affect how circadian cycling occurs. I'm also getting asked, could a daytime nap help the memory? Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on how long your nap is. But yeah, they have done studies where people have slept during the day rather than at night, and saw improvement on memory performance after learning a rule set. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide, but if you guys have any other questions for memory, feel free to put that in the chat. So now I wanted to talk about emotional regulation. And so there have been a few studies both in adulthood as well as in adolescence where they've looked at the ability to regulate emotions and how that relates to lack of sleep. And so on the left here, I just included kind of a chart where we can look at all of the different ways that, or all the different stop points, I should say, of where our brain has to function for emotional regulation. So we can experience a situation, draw our attention to that situation, appraise that situation, so basically figure out our understanding of how we feel about it, and then also have a response to that situation. And so there's a lot of hypotheses for how sleep can impact regulation of emotions. And these are kind of some of our hypotheses for why. So it can impact the way that we attend to negative stimuli. It can lead to us having poor abilities for understanding how we're feeling, as well as amplifying our emotional responses. And so here I included some data from a study where they looked at self-reported mood after a stressor was introduced. So basically they looked at how sleep deprived people were based on either a sleep deprivation condition or a rested condition. And then they introduced a low stressor and looked at how people were able to I guess, deal with their stress during that portion. So they looked at things like fatigue, anxiety, depression, anger, and subjective stress overall. And you can see that the sleep-deprived individuals had a significantly higher self-reported stress score for fatigue, anxiety, hostility, and anger, as well as subjective stress. And so we're seeing a lot of different types of emotional regulation as well as emotional presentation are altered by how much sleep that we are getting during the day. And they've done a few studies as well in people with depressive symptoms and seen changes in how largely those depressive symptoms are being affected by lack of sleep. So this occurs in both clinical and non-clinical populations. And now we're going to move on to metabolism. And so I pulled this from a paper where they kind of talked about a lot of different types of metabolic changes that we'll see in sleep and lack of sleep, sorry. And specifically looking at how that can affect changes in glucose regulation, diabetes, as well as inflammation. And so if you look here, we look up at lack of sleep and what that can trigger. So lack of sleep can trigger things like intake of food outside of the hunger cues that we have, as well as fatigue, reduced activity during the day, and some changes in hormones. And we'll talk about that a bit more on the next slide, but these hormones can be specifically related to appetite and eating behavior. We see that a lot of these changes in activity and eating behavior can impact things like insulin resistance, as well as the regulation of glucose in our body, which can lead to things like type 2 diabetes. This can also in turn change the brain hormone interactions that are occurring in our body, specifically related to these appetite hormones, as well as increased inflammation in the body. We see that changes in circadian rhythms can also change glucose tolerance and these hormones, as well as trigger things like inflammation and insulin resistance, sorry. And so these go hand in hand with lack of sleep and changes in circadian rhythms, since if you're getting less sleep, your circadian rhythms are not going to adjust as well as if you were getting a good amount of sleep for yourself. And so there can be consequences within our metabolic activity for the body for how this can, or for how lack of sleep can affect us. And so here I just wanted to talk briefly about these hormones that I was talking about on the last slide that are related to eating behavior and appetite. And so there are two really big hormones that people like to talk about when they're talking about appetite and hormones. And these are known as leptin and ghrelin. So these are our two appetite hormones. So ghrelin is the appetite hormone, whereas leptin is satiety. So ghrelin would be what's responsible for us being hungry and kind of experiencing those hunger cues as our body has gone through the day and increased time from our last meal. Leptin, on the other hand, is the satiety hormone. So this is kind of what's going to be giving us that feeling of fullness after we've had an appetite, after we had a meal, and then also that brings us through until ghrelin kind of increases again and gets us ready for our next meal. So here I just wanted to show a graph where they plotted changes in leptin and ghrelin over the day. And you can see that this B, L, and D have to do with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And when we see the spikes in leptin and ghrelin related to those. So you can see that ghrelin increases through the day until they're at their highest, then they have breakfast, and that will sink down, stay low for a while, and then shoot back up when it's around lunchtime and back down again. Leptin has the opposite, where it decreases and then increases again because it's helping us with those feelings of being full, and then kind of goes in an opposite trend of what we see for ghrelin. So these work hand in hand with each other to help regulate how we eat. And when we look at lack of sleep, we see changes in how leptin and ghrelin are being secreted in the body. So on the left, I have ghrelin, and on the right, I have leptin, and they looked at the average nightly sleep, or the total sleep time for these individuals, where they then had the levels of leptin and ghrelin actually recorded. And you can see that people who are having lower amounts of sleep have higher levels of ghrelin, meaning that they're going to have more of those appetitive cues throughout their day. And they're going to feel more hungry throughout their day, versus those who had like 8 hours of sleep have much lower levels than the 4.5 hours. On the other hand, when we look at leptin, those who have a lot of sleep, around 9 hours, have really high levels of ghrelin, meaning that they're going to feel more satiated throughout the day, while the people who had a low average nightly sleep time, so about 6 hours, had lower levels of ghrelin. So you can imagine if you have higher levels of this appetitive hormone and lower levels of the satiety hormone, you're likely going to be eating more throughout the day. And depending on what you're consuming and stuff like that, that might affect further complications with your metabolism. And so the last thing I want to talk about in terms of things that we see change with sleep is the immune system. And so during sleeping, our body is going to create a variety of molecules and inflammatory markers called cytokines, and that will help regulate the inflammation pathways in the immune system, as well as promote sleep. And when we're sick, our body can actually create more of these inflammatory markers during sleep, and that can help us fight infections. And so I briefly wanted to talk about how our body might enhance the immune system while we're sleeping. And so when we're sleeping, we have these cells called antigen presenting cells. And these are basically cells that if you have a virus or a bacterial infection, they take specific markers from that foreign substance in your body, whether that be a virus or a bacterial infection, and they'll present a marker from that bacteria called an antigen. When that happens, things called T cells can attach to those antigens and then create more T cells that are specifically specialized for that antigen. And so this is kind of how our immune system works where if you've had a cold, you'll never get that same cold again, because now we have specialized T cells that are going to immediately attack that cold once it's reintroduced to the system. So usually if you have a family member that you're close with and you have a cold, they'll get it a few days later, but then you won't get the cold from them again, because we have these specialized T cells ready to go. These specialized T cells can also help bolster our immune system further, so they'll create downstream signaling to B cells, which will produce antibodies against that antigen. And so it helps prepare our immune system to fight an infection, as well as it fights any current infections we might have in our body. And so with the immune system especially, sometimes our immune system will kind of force us to slow down, and this is something called sickness behavior. And so when we're sick, our body is going to make us feel fatigued and lethargic. We're going to have muscle aches, a fever. And this is kind of our body's signal to us to force us to rest. Because if we're resting, we're going to be able to recover faster. And it's going to be easy for our body to kind of make sure that it's done its job with fighting an infection, rather than if we're still active and moving around during the day, our body's going to spend energy on helping us be active rather than putting that towards the immune system like it would like to. And so this is kind of just a really big point to make sure that we're listening to our body's signals when we're off, or when we're feeling off or sick, making sure to rest and kind of help to promote that proper immune functioning through sleep, and just being restful and taking it easy for those few days until we feel better. And so before I move on to sleep disruptions, I'm going to just briefly look at the chat, because I saw some information come into the chat, or some questions rather.
I think it's the first question is, should you take allergy medicines before bed or an hour before bed for good quality sleep?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know there are specific timings that that will impact the absorption of certain drugs based on circadian cycling, but I'm not sure exactly what the timing would be. There was a really good resource that I came across while I was doing research for this talk, that I'd be happy to share, that would that gave some information on how to decide when to take medicine for sleeping. The next question was about 12-hour shifts. I'm going to talk about shift work a bit later, actually on the next slide. So we'll talk about that in a second. And then Marcia asked something about COVID-19. This is more just for our body's immune system to adapt to viruses and bacterial infections. I'm not really sure how COVID specifically interacts with the immune system. Okay, so I'm going to move forward to sleep disruptions and talk about some common disruptors that occur throughout our lifespans. So like I mentioned, I'm first going to talk briefly about shift work. So for those of you guys who are not super familiar with shift work is basically a job where employees have to work outside of normal business hours. So usually working time between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. And this can cause disruptions to the natural dark light cycling of daily life, because we're exposed to light and activity at times where our body would normally expect darkness at nighttime. And so this can cause circadian disruption, and like I mentioned, circadian disruption can cause some changes in the metabolism, specifically related to hormone regulation and inflammation. However, this is not going to be the same experience for everybody who goes through shift work. And so like I mentioned, there are a lot of genetic and other factors that impact our circadian cycling. And so there's not always going to be one set change that everybody is going to experience if they work the same night shift. It'll kind of vary from person to person. And that's why some people feel like they work better on night shifts versus others who really don't like working on night shifts, because some people will just adjust a little bit easier. And like I mentioned, it's dependent on a variety of factors, but it's not common to fully adapt your body. So you'll never experience somebody who's fully nocturnal. Instead, it will be more of a gradual adjustment where it becomes easier, but not a full adjustment where somebody is going to be okay working normal hours and being fully active when it's dark and sleeping when it's light out. We also see disruptions in sleep as we age. So the sleep quality and the duration are going to decrease with age. And specifically when we're looking at stages of sleep, the amount of time that we spend in REM sleep, so that rapid eye movement stage, is going to decrease with age. And so there are a variety of changes that go on in our brain when we age. So specifically, we see changes in the structure. So we'll see decreases in certain levels of gray matter or just types of cells in specific regions, such as like the prefrontal cortex or the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which I mentioned earlier. And then we'll also see changes in the metabolic rate of some of these brain regions. So the metabolism of our cells in the brain might slow a bit. And that just is something that happens with age and therefore could impact sleep. And so it could be that the changes in our brain are triggering us to have poorer sleep. There's also some evidence that indicates that maybe older adults just need less sleep. So you tend to see a shift as we get older where we go to bed earlier, but we also wake up earlier during the day, and people tend to shift from being late risers and late workers to more early risers as they age. And so it could be that just our body knows that as we age, we need less sleep, and therefore it is adjusting the circadian cycling that we're experiencing so that we don't have to sleep as long as normal. And so it's something that's still being investigated further, but there are a lot of hypotheses going on for why we could see this change in sleep as we age. And then, like I've mentioned a few times, light exposure is also going to be a factor when we're trying to understand how sleep disruption can occur. And so this I pulled from the Society for Research on Biological Rhythms. And so they have a few different public outreach briefs that I would highly recommend going and looking at if you want to learn more. This is one that I pulled specifically related to light exposure. And so basically their mantra is light during the day, dark at night. And so you want to make sure that you are exposing yourself to bright light, ideally natural light. So going outside, being outside in the morning, especially so that you're able to wake up better, and really avoiding making sure that the only light that you're getting is just that dim indoor light if you have fluorescent lighting, making sure that you're getting a good mix of bright days. There's also things that they're called light boxes, where they'll actually simulate like the lux of the sun, and so those might also be a good, they've been looked into for people who have like seasonal affective disorder, where the sun may not be as bright in the mornings, and that can help with circadian cycling as well. And then at night, making sure you're aiming for a darker night. So as you're winding down for bed, and we'll talk about this a bit more, but making sure that we are reducing our light exposure as we start to wind down, making sure our lights are turned off when we're going to bed, and that we're not trying to sleep in a bright room. And this will really help with kind of making sure that there's less sleep disruption from light exposure through the day and at night. And so now just briefly, I wanted to talk about some tips for how to sleep better. This is pulled from the Sleep Foundation website, where they gave some tips on how to have healthy sleep habits. And so the first one is really to stick to a schedule. So consistently going to bed and waking up at the same time every day. And this includes on weekends. There's a phenomenon called social jet lag that I didn't get too much into, but if you were kind of adjusting your sleep schedule based on social experiences that might impact your circadian cycling. So making sure that you're as consistent as you can and staying on a schedule with sleeping. And with that, including a wind down routine into your day before you go to bed. So like I mentioned, making sure that the lights get dimmed as we're starting to get ready for bed and making sure that we're not exposing ourselves to too much light. And then finding time to do some relaxing activities. So things like reading, meditating, journaling, doing some art if you're an artist, but kind of pulling yourself into these more relaxing routines so that you're able to wind down and relax for the night. Along with that, exercising regularly. So making sure that we're being consistent in an exercise regimen every day will really help with experiencing better sleep at night. And with that, they suggested that you can exercise at any time of day, just not at the expense of sleep. So don't stay up until 12:30 just to make sure you get your workout in for the day if you can't fit it in earlier. Just make sure that you are exercising and regularly keeping active to help with your sleep. Light exposure, like I mentioned, making sure that you get bright natural light during the day and you're sleeping in the dark, and keeping that consistent so that you're not interfering with your circadian cycling. And then getting comfortable. So making sure your bedroom is cool. So they recommend between 60 to 67 degrees, and getting a mattress and pillows that are comfortable. I know I got a question in the Qualtrics survey last week about when to replace a mattress. I honestly don't know. That's a really great question. I think it just kind of depends on your comfort. If your mattress doesn't feel comfortable, then maybe consider getting a new mattress, and that might help a lot with sleep. And then sleeping at night. So avoiding taking naps, especially in the late afternoon, will really make sure that you sleep well at night, since you're not resting yourself during the day and impacting how you'll then be able to sleep later on. And then the last one talks about recording your sleep. So this is specifically people who have trouble sleeping consistently and have tried a lot of these techniques, but haven't really seen much success with them. So a lot of the times doctors, when you talk about them with sleep disruption and sleep issues, they'll ask you to record your sleep. So record when you've had a good night's sleep, what were the things that happened before you went to bed, when you woke up, did you have certain noises at night that woke you up if you were disrupted, and kind of recording what's going on with your sleep so that they're better able to diagnose what could be going on. And so just making sure you have a sleep diary or a record if you decide to talk to your doctor about any issues you've been having with sleep.
Somebody asked about, sorry to interrupt you, but somebody,
no, that's okay.
If sleeping with a red light or a night light is beneficial, or should there not be any light in the room?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure regarding like a red light or a night light. Their recommendation is to keep the room as dark as possible, but I think that it kind of depends on how bright the light is and stuff like that. So I'm not sure more specifically about like specific types of light.
Right. And is there a connection between a full moon and poor sleep?
I have no idea. That's a great question.
It is.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Okay. All right. We'll address some of these when you're finished.
Yeah.
Those were
Perfect.
related more to what you were talking about.
Cool. So I just wanted to talk about how much sleep we actually need. So this is again pulled from the Sleep Foundation. And they actually just made some adjustments recently on their sleep recommendations for different age ranges. And so here I've just included what their age ranges are and how much sleep they recommend. I specifically wanted to highlight school-age children and teenagers. So the 6 to 17 years old requires between like 8 and 11 hours of sleep per night. And this kind of gets into a whole different issue that I didn't spend some time talking about today with the idea of like school start times, and if they should be pushed later on during the day. But I did want to highlight the fact that school-age children and teenagers do require more sleep than basically any other age range older than that. And so making sure that we are kind to our school-age children and teenagers who maybe feel like they're sleeping, way more than they need to. It's likely because their body needs it. And so if you have kids who are in that school age or teenagers, maybe encouraging earlier sleep, earlier times to go to sleep so that they're able to achieve those sleep recommendations before a school day will be helpful. But especially during quarantine right now, if you have a teenager that's sleeping in really late, they might just need that sleep. So just being kind to certain sleep recommendations. And then I wanted to talk briefly about dreaming because I did get some questions about this in the Qualtrics survey. We don't really know why dreaming occurs. As scientists, we've tried to figure out why, and there's a lot of theories for why, but again, we're not entirely sure. There are a few different theories that I highlighted here. So it's thought that maybe it helps us process information and the emotions experienced during our daily lives. And so this kind of would go hand in hand with the idea that sleep helps us regulate emotions. So if we're able to dream and regulate some of that emotion in the dream, we're able to then use that experience during our daily life. Like I mentioned, with memory consolidation, it's thought that maybe dreaming might help with memory consolidation because our brain is replaying some of the memories that we experienced either during that day or during previous days, where then it has to reactivate those memories in order to consolidate. And so maybe dreaming is a process that occurs because we're reliving some of these experiences in our brain. And dreams are sometimes tied to mental illness. So a good example of this is for patients with PTSD, they're more likely to have nightmares than somebody without PTSD. And so it could be that mental illness and mental health might impact how we dream. And like I mentioned, REM sleep is going to decrease with age. And so that could be why you're experiencing a harder time remembering dreams or having dreams as you get older. And so now just looking at some key takeaways. Like I mentioned, sleep is a required and vital process that our body undergoes. It's about 1/3 of our lifetime that we spend sleeping. It's important for memory consolidation and learning, and sleep disruptions can be detrimental for our immune system, cognitive functioning, metabolic functions, and so it's really important that we maintain good sleep habits. And then dreaming is really that process that we don't fully understand, but if you have good dreams, make sure to enjoy them and kind of take that as something that we are still learning more about. That is all I have for today. I wanted to briefly talk about what we're going to be talking about next week. So we have Rue Liu from the University of Illinois. She's actually a recent graduate. She's going to be talking about decoding diets that you saw on the internet. So things like keto, gluten-free, and fasting. If you have any questions now about these topics, I have a new survey for this week, so it's not the exact same one as last week. The link is there, and I'm sure that will also get put in the chat. But make sure that you fill out that form ahead of time so that we're able to get those questions to Rue and our other speakers for the future, so that they're able to make sure they address some of those questions in their talks. And then I also wanted to talk about another webinar that's happening through the Interdisciplinary Health Science Institute. They're going to be talking about mental and behavioral health during COVID-19. And this is a free Zoom webinar. You can register ahead of time for Monday, June 22nd. And we wanted to bring this up to you guys because we thought it would be a really great webinar and experience for you guys to go to. And so with that, I will take questions, and I'm going to look back at some of the questions that I missed earlier. But feel free to put some questions in the chat or unmute yourself.
And if you are looking for, if you signed up for CEUs or CPDUs, please go to the Google Doc and sign in. I put the link in the chat box. Just put in your initials. Some of you, I can see your name, so I put an X next to your name. But if you could go in and initial that you were here, because sometimes you are just come into Zoom with your first name or, you know, Mary Lynn's iPad, and we don't know who you are. So if you could please go to the Google Doc and sign in that you are here so you receive credit for being here for CEUs or CPDUs, we would appreciate it. If you have any questions about that, you can put those in the chat box. Also, we will be submitting the CPDUs. If you signed up for CEUs, you will get an email from the Continuing Education Institute. You have, I believe, 48 hours to complete their evaluation, and they will send you your CEU form. So make sure you do not ignore that email and you submit your evaluation.
All right, I'm gonna go through some questions, and I apologize ahead of time. My dog and my cat are not happy with each other right now, so if you guys hear them barking, I will mute myself quickly.
Corinne, I think we left off at how accurate are fitness wearables, Fitbit?
Yeah, that's a good question. So those are, from what I know, and I'm not a big expert on like fitness wearables and accelerometers, but from what I understand, they use similar collection techniques to what are done in more research settings, but they're not as accurate as those that are used in like labs on campus. And so I think that there's nothing wrong with using those, but I'm not sure how accurate they are in comparison to like a more sophisticated research instrument.
Okay, great. Is there an estimated amount of light exposure per day, like 20 minutes or much more? Is there an estimated amount that you need?
I don't know if there's a specific amount, and I could maybe look back at the resource that I used for some of the light exposure stuff to give you a better answer. But I would definitely recommend going on the, let me see what the website was called again. This website here, so the Society for Research on Biological Rhythms has a lot of public outreach information out there, and so they might be able to give you a bit more information as well, since I'm not able to give you the exact answer on that.
Okay.
And there's also a QR code you can follow at the bottom corner of this.
And another listener, she talked about going to sleep, getting up about 1 o'clock in the morning and not being able to get back to sleep for a couple of hours. How to break this cycle?
Yeah, so that's, I think the big thing is, especially with something like that, where if it's consistent, like talking to your doctor and seeing if they can recommend any kind of medication. I know that there are, there's a lot of evidence for like melatonin consumption, but I'm not super familiar on the research regarding like certain sleep aids. But like definitely thinking about what is occurring, either light exposure or maybe your sleep partner snores and that's waking you up, and kind of thinking about some of these disruptors that might be occurring that you're not as aware of as you think you might be since you're sleeping, and then figuring out ways to combat those if it is a sleep disruptor, or talking to your doctor about maybe medications or supplements that might be able to help you get a better night's sleep.
Okay, very good. And another question, how does alcohol affect sleep? This person is talking specifically about 8 ounces or so in the evening.
Yeah, so I didn't talk about like late meal consumption, but it depends on the timing that you're consuming like alcoholic beverages. But there can be some disruption on sleep depending on the timing. So if it's close to bed and you're consuming a large meal or alcohol, that can disrupt your sleep. But if it's earlier on in the evening, then it might not affect your sleep. But I'm not sure on the exact timing that they give.
And can having too many dreams during sleep be disruptive to, or cause you to feel more tired?
That's something I'm not sure. That's a really great question.
It is a good question, actually. Sometimes you remember that you dreamt all night, and other times you don't remember that you dreamt at all. So
exactly.
Can you put the link for the webinar Monday on mental health on chat?
Yeah, Kelsey put it in the chat. So if you look for Kelsey
great.
M. Hassabort, she put the information there.
Okay, great. There is also an evaluation link in the chat as well as a handout. And so you can get that from there. Chelsea, I believe you also sent it via email to everyone. Let me see if there are any other questions.
I think somebody was asking about, let's see, hot flashes. So I think also a good question. I know in a couple weeks, Catherine Hatcher will be talking about menopause and some of the changes that we experience. And she is actually a great resource that I got a lot of my information on sleep regarding, because she does study circadian cycling and menopause. So that might be a great question to put in the Qualtrics survey, and she would be able to address that then.
Great. Another person said, what about eating in the middle of the night in order to go back to sleep?
Yeah, I think
I've
it
done that
depends on,
before.
yeah, I think it depends on like what you're eating and, you know, how much sugar and maybe caffeine might be hidden in those meals. And so maybe talking to your doctor about if you require doing that, what kind of recommendations they would give for certain meals.
This person says it's hard to fall asleep in the dark. For this person, I wake up as soon as I fall asleep and tend to hallucinate. Most of the time I don't fall asleep till late night, although I try to sleep earlier. I also have nightmares most of the day.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly why that would be. I think that's something, again, where keeping a sleep journal and maybe talking to your doctor about some of those disruptions would be a really great next step for you.
Why I usually feel sleepy waking up even after 8 to 10 hours of sleep.
Yeah, another good question. Like I mentioned, let me include the sleep recommendations here. So some people require a bit more sleep. So this is just a range in an average kind of range that they've given. So you might just require more sleep. It's also possible that you're oversleeping. And so sometimes there are experiences where people sleep more than they need to. And because of that, that causes them to feel a bit more groggy and sleepy through the day. So maybe thinking about waking up early and incorporating some of the action items that I included here with making sure that we're exercising regularly, getting some light exposure in the morning to help you wake up during the day.
Very good. And Evelyn said she enjoys reading before bed and understands that it is good to read before bed to help relax you. Uses an e-reader. Is that different?
Yeah, so from what I understand, and I might not be the best person to answer this question. Maybe that would be a good question for Catherine, just regarding like circadian cycling, since she is much more an expert on that than I am. But I think for the, in terms of e-readers, I don't think that the light exposure from an e-reader is going to be like really detrimental to your sleep. Just making sure it's not super bright. And I know like the recommendations here were to maybe use like a dark mode. So if they have like a nighttime mode or a dark mode, that might be beneficial to keep doing too. But if you don't notice that it impacts your sleep, then it's probably okay. I also just wanted to highlight, Kelsey just sent me a message to let me know about waking up or feeling groggy even after 8 to 10 hours of sleep. She recommended that sometimes when you're using an alarm clock, it's waking you up from a deeper stage of sleep than if you were awakening more naturally from a lighter stage, and that can impact your fatigue through the day. So if you're using an alarm clock, maybe setting it for a slightly different time a little bit later, or using some kind of more natural waking up device. So I know some people have watches that vibrate to wake them up, and that might more naturally wake you up.
Someone also said that if a person is tired after 8 hours or so of sleep, when they wake tired, it could be some sort of sleep disorder.
Yeah.
That they may need to talk with a doctor about.
Yeah, and so definitely if you feel like you're having a sleep disturbance, I would really recommend using a sleep record. I've had issues sleeping in the past, and recording my sleep and kind of getting to the bottom to some of the trends that I was having in terms of days that I felt more sleepy or stuff like that was really helpful when talking to my doctor.
Okay, and our last comment is from one of our family life educators, Sherry Burcham. She said she has a clock that has a light that comes on like the sunrise, and it works well for her.
Yeah, Cherry, is that one of the light boxes? Do you know? Does it have like that really high lux level?
Sherry could probably talk.
Yeah. So basically they have these like light boxes that will have like a super high lux so that it kind of simulates sunlight, and they really recommend them for people with seasonal affective disorder.
Excellent. Very good. Okay, I don't see any other questions here, Corinne. So I would like to thank everyone for attending. And just as a reminder, Corinne already told us, but as a reminder, next week, June 23rd, our next webinar is called Decoding That Diet You Saw on the Internet, Keto, Gluten-Free, and Fasting. So we hope you join us next week. Here is the link for it if you didn't see it prior. And Corinne, thank you for a marvelous talk on sleep today and brain function. And if there aren't any other questions, we hope to see you next week.
Thank you for tuning into CUWise TV. We hope you enjoyed the show. This video can be accessed anytime on youtube.com. In the YouTube search bar, type in UPTV6 and look for their microphone logo. We hope you will join us again next week for more local, engaging content designed specifically